The apartment door swings open. Detective Mike Pacheco steps inside, and the world stops. It's the 7th of January, 1972. Waikiki. A wellness check that should have been routine. A young woman missed her shift at work. Co-workers got worried. Management called it in. But the moment his boot crosses the threshold, Pacheco knows. The silence is wrong. Too heavy. Too still. The air tastes metallic. His flashlight cuts through the dim room, catching edges of furniture, a toppled chair, scattered belongings. Then the beam lands on the floor near the bedroom, and he sees her, 19 years old, her whole life ahead of her. Now lying motionless in a pool of dark red that soaked into the carpet, over 24 stab wounds. Pacheco has seen bar fights, domestic disputes, even a shooting last year. But this is different. This is rage. This is personal. This is someone who wanted her erased. He takes a breath, steadies himself, and radios it in. We've got a homicide. Female victim, young. It's bad. Behind him, his partner turns away, hand over his mouth. The killer is already gone. Vanished into the tropical breeze, into the crowded streets of Honolulu, into a life of freedom. For 50 years. If you're new here, this is where we dive deep into real-life crime stories, cases that shook communities, stumped investigators, and left families searching for answers. Some of these stories are solved quickly. Others take a little longer, 50 years longer, to be exact. Today, we're talking about the murder of Nancy Anderson, a 19-year-old woman who moved to Hawaii chasing dreams of independence and a fresh start, only to have her life violently ripped away in her own apartment. For nearly half a century, her killer walked free. No arrests, no justice, just silence. But here's the thing about silence, it doesn't last forever. In 2019, a cold case unit in Honolulu dusted off Nancy's file, armed with technology that didn't exist in 1972. What they found would crack the case wide open and lead them to a suspect who had been hiding in plain sight for decades. This case is a testament to the power of persistence, the evolution of forensic science, and the families who refuse to let their loved ones be forgotten. Before we dive into this story, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Cases like Nancy's need to be told, and your support helps us keep her memory alive and bring awareness to unsolved crimes everywhere. Seriously, it takes 2 seconds, and it makes a massive difference. Now, let's get into it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where are you watching from right now. New York, California, maybe somewhere international. I love seeing where this community stretches across the globe. All right. Let's go back to January 1972. Hawaii was booming. Tourism was exploding. Waikiki Beach was the ultimate destination, a slice of paradise where mainlanders came to escape the cold, soak up the sun, and live a little. For young people especially, Hawaii represented freedom, adventure, and possibility. Nancy Anderson was one of those dreamers. She wasn't born in Hawaii. She came from the mainland, eager to carve out her own path. At just 19 years old, she packed her bags, said goodbye to everything familiar, and moved to Waikiki to start fresh. She wasn't chasing fame or fortune, she just wanted independence, a place of her own, a job, a chance to prove she could make it on her own terms. She found work at a local McDonald's. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. She was earning her own money, paying her own rent, living in a modest 1-bedroom apartment right in the heart of Waikiki. To her, that apartment wasn't just 4 walls, it was proof that she'd made it. She was doing it. She was living. By all accounts, Nancy was reliable. She showed up on time. She did her job. She was friendly with coworkers, kept to herself when she needed to, and seemed excited about what was ahead. So when she didn't show up for her shift on the morning of the 7th of January, 1972, people noticed immediately. Nancy wasn't the type to just not show up. No call, no explanation, nothing. Her coworkers were confused, then concerned. Management tried calling her apartment, no answer. Something felt off. Finally, someone made the decision to send police to do a wellness check. That decision led to a discovery that would haunt Honolulu for the next 50 years. What investigators found inside Nancy's apartment that day wasn't just a tragedy, it was a nightmare. The brutality of the attack, the number of wounds, the sheer violence of it all. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't random. This was deeply, disturbingly personal. And whoever did it, they got away with it. For decades, But the story doesn't end there. Not even close. Because in 2019, everything changed. Let's talk about Nancy. Because before she became a case file, before she became a statistic, before she became a cold case that haunted detectives for decades, she was a person. A young woman with hopes, dreams, fears, and a future she was just starting to build. Nancy Anderson was 19 years old in early 1972. Just a teenager, really. The kind of age where you're standing on the edge of adulthood, figuring out who you are and what you want from life. Some people at 19 are in college, some are still living at home. Nancy, she wanted something different. She wanted independence. She didn't want to wait around for life to happen to her. She wanted to make it happen. And for her, that meant leaving everything familiar behind and starting fresh somewhere completely new. Hawaii. Now, if you've never been to Hawaii, let me paint the picture for you. Waikiki, in 1972, was electric. The beaches were packed with tourists from the mainland, families, honeymooners, surfers, hippies, servicemen on leave. The hotels were booming. Bars and restaurants lined the streets. Music floated out of open windows. The smell of salt water mixed with sunscreen and grilled pineapple. Palm trees swayed in the breeze. The ocean was impossibly blue. It was paradise. And for young people especially, it represented freedom. This was the early 72nds, a time when the counterculture movement was still going strong, when young Americans were rejecting traditional paths and seeking something more authentic, more real. Moving to Hawaii wasn't just a geographic change, it was a statement. It said, I'm going to live life on my own terms. That's exactly what Nancy wanted. So she packed her bags, bought a plane ticket, and moved to Waikiki. She didn't have a trust fund. She didn't have a safety net. She had courage, determination, and a belief that she could make it work. She found a small one-bedroom apartment in the heart of Waikiki. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't spacious, but it was hers, her own place, her own key, her own front door that she could lock at night and feel like she was building something real. She got a job at a local McDonald's. Not exactly glamorous work, but it paid the bills. It gave her structure. It connected her to other people. Her co-workers described her as friendly, reliable, and hardworking. She wasn't the type to complain. She showed up. She did her job. She was building a life, one shift at a time. Outside of work, Nancy was still figuring things out. What did she like to do? Who did she want to become? At 19, those questions don't have easy answers. You're still experimenting, still discovering, still trying to separate who you are from who you were raised to be. Nancy loved the beach. Of course she did, who wouldn't, living in Waikiki. She loved the feeling of sun on her skin, the sound of waves crashing, the way the ocean made everything else feel small and manageable. She was learning to surf, or at least trying to. She'd grab a board and paddle out, wobbling on the water, laughing when she wiped out, determined to get better. She loved meeting new people. Waikiki was full of transient souls, travelers passing through, fellow mainlanders trying to make it work, locals who'd lived there their whole lives. Every conversation was a chance to learn something new, to hear a different story, to feel connected to something bigger. She was also adjusting to living alone. That's not always easy, especially at 19. There are moments of loneliness, moments of doubt, moments where you wonder if you made the right choice, if you should have stayed home where things were familiar and safe. But Nancy was tough. She was figuring it out. By early January 1972, she'd been in Hawaii for a few months. She was settling in, getting used to the rhythm of the island. Her apartment was starting to feel like home. Her job was steady. She was making friends. Life was far from perfect, but it was hers, and that mattered. The morning of the 7th of January 1972 should have been just another day. Nancy was scheduled to work a shift at McDonald's. She probably woke up early, maybe made some coffee, or grabbed a quick breakfast. She would have gotten dressed in her work uniform, tied her hair back, checked herself in the mirror. Just another shift, just another day in paradise. She lived close enough to walk to work, or maybe she caught a ride. Either way, her coworkers were expecting her. Her manager had the schedule posted. Nancy was on it. She'd be there. Except she wouldn't. Because sometime before that shift started, maybe the night before, maybe that morning, something happened inside her apartment. Something violent, something unthinkable. Nancy never made it to work. And the life she'd been building, the independence she'd fought for, The dreams she'd been chasing, the future she'd been imagining, all of it ended in that small one-bedroom apartment in Waikiki. She was 19 years old. She should have had decades ahead of her. Relationships, travel, career changes, maybe kids someday. Maybe a totally different path we can't even imagine. The point is, she should have had the chance to find out. Instead, someone took that from her. And for 50 years, that someone got away with it. But Nancy's story didn't end on the 7th of January, 1972. Because even in death, even in silence, she refused to be forgotten. The first person to notice something was wrong was Nancy's shift supervisor at McDonald's. Let's call him Ron. He'd been managing the location for about 2 years, and he prided himself on knowing his team. He knew who showed up early, who cut it close, who called in sick every other week. Nancy wasn't one of those people. She was dependable. If she was scheduled, she showed up. So when her shift started at 10 a.m., and she wasn't there, Ron noticed immediately. At first, he figured she was running late. Traffic, maybe. Or she overslept. It happens. He covered her register himself and kept glancing at the door, expecting her to rush in any minute, apologizing and tying her apron on. But 10:15 came and went. Then 10:30. By 11 a.m., Ron was confused. This wasn't like Nancy at all. He asked the other workers if anyone had heard from her. Had she called? Left a message? Mentioned she might be late? Nothing. One of her co-workers, let's call her Diane, said she'd seen Nancy a couple days earlier and everything seemed fine. Normal. Nancy hadn't mentioned being sick or having plans to skip work. Diane shrugged. Maybe something came up? But Ron had a feeling. Something felt off. He tried calling Nancy's apartment. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. No answer. Now he was worried. He called again an hour later. Still nothing. By early afternoon, Ron made a decision. He told Diane and another coworker to cover the registers. He was going to drive over to Nancy's apartment and check on her himself. Maybe she was sick and couldn't get to the phone. Maybe she'd hurt herself and needed help. Maybe it was nothing, and she'd be embarrassed that he showed up. But he had to know. Ron drove through the busy streets of Waikiki, past tourists in bright shirts carrying surfboards, past hotels with valets parking rental cars, past street vendors selling shaved ice. It was a gorgeous day, mid-70 bright sun, light breeze, the kind of day that made people forget their problems. Nancy's apartment building was modest, a low-rise complex, nothing fancy, the kind of place where young workers and students rented, month to month. The paint was faded, the stairs creaked, but it was clean, safe, affordable. It was home to dozens of people just trying to make it in paradise. Ron climbed the stairs to Nancy's unit. Second floor, corner apartment. He knocked on the door. Nancy? It's Ron, from work. You okay in there? Silence. He knocked again, harder this time. Nancy, we're worried about you. Just want to make sure you're all right. Still nothing. Ron tried the doorknob. It turned. The door was unlocked. That stopped him cold. He stood there in the hallway, hand on the knob, suddenly very aware that something was deeply wrong. Nancy was careful. She wouldn't just leave her door unlocked, would she? He pushed the door open a crack. Nancy, I'm coming in. Okay? Just checking on you. The apartment was dim, curtains drawn, hot and stuffy, like the windows hadn't been opened in a while. And then he smelled it. Something metallic. Something wrong. Ron stepped inside, and his eyes adjusted to the low light. He saw overturned furniture, a chair knocked over, a lamp on the floor, signs of a struggle, and then he saw her. Nancy was lying near the bedroom, motionless, her body crumpled on the floor. Blood had pooled around her, dark and dried, soaking into the carpet. Ron's brain couldn't process it at first. This didn't make sense. This wasn't real. This was Nancy, the girl who smiled at customers, who talked about learning to surf, who'd just started her life here. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet, and ran out of the apartment. He found the building manager and told him to call the police. Asterisk. Now. Asterisk. Within minutes, Honolulu Police Department units were on the scene. Officers secured the area, cordoned off the apartment, and called in detectives. This wasn't a wellness check anymore. This was a homicide. Detective Mike Pacheco was one of the first investigators to arrive. He'd been with HPD for nearly a decade, seen his share of bar fights, domestic incidents, the occasional gang violence. But when he stepped into Nancy's apartment, even he felt his stomach turn. Nancy had been stabbed. Not once, not twice, over 24 times. The attack was frenzied, relentless, the kind of violence that doesn't come from a stranger looking to rob someone. This was Time's personal asterisk. This was rage. This was someone who wanted to hurt her, to destroy her. Pacheco knelt near the body, careful not to disturb the scene. Nancy was fully clothed. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms. She'd fought back. She'd tried to protect herself. But whoever attacked her had overpowered her. The apartment was small, so it didn't take long to survey the scene. No signs of forced entry. The door had been unlocked when Ron arrived. But there were no scratches on the lock. No broken windows. Nothing to suggest someone had broken in, which meant one of two things. Either Nancy had left the door unlocked herself, or she'd let her attacker inside. Did she know this person? Pacheco walked through the rest of the apartment. The bedroom was undisturbed. Her belongings were still there. A small TV, a radio, some jewelry on the dresser. Nothing appeared stolen. This wasn't a robbery. In the kitchen, there were dishes in the sink, a half-empty cup of coffee on the counter, mail on the table. Everything suggested Nancy had been going about a normal day when something or someone interrupted it. The living room told a different story. The overturned chair, the lamp on the ground, clear signs of a struggle. Nancy had fought. She'd tried to get away. But her attacker had been stronger, faster, or maybe just more determined. Pacheco stepped back outside to brief the other officers. We've got a young female victim, 19 years old. Multiple stab wounds. No signs of forced entry. No obvious motive. We need to canvass the building, talk to every neighbor, find out if anyone saw or heard anything. The officer taking notes looked pale. You think she knew the guy? I don't know, Pacheco said. But somebody wanted her dead. And they didn't just want her dead, they wanted her to suffer. Neighbors were questioned throughout the afternoon. Most hadn't heard anything unusual. One woman said she'd heard some noise the night before, maybe a raised voice, maybe something falling, but she hadn't thought much of it. Apartments were thin-walled. People argued. Things got dropped. It didn't seem worth investigating. Now, of course, she wished she'd called someone. Another neighbor, an older man who lived across the hall, said he'd seen Nancy a few days earlier. She'd smiled and said hello. Seemed fine. He hadn't seen anyone suspicious hanging around the building. No one had heard screaming. No one had seen anyone fleeing the scene. Whoever killed Nancy had done it quietly, or at least quietly enough that no one intervened. By late afternoon, Nancy's body was removed from the apartment and taken to the medical examiner's office. The scene was photographed, evidence was collected, and the apartment was sealed. Detective Pacheco stood outside the building as the sun began to set over Waikiki. Tourists walked by, laughing, carrying beach bags, talking about where to get dinner. They had no idea that just a few floors above them, a young woman's life had been violently erased. Pacheco lit a cigarette and stared at the apartment door. Somewhere out there, Nancy's killer was walking free. Maybe they were still in Waikiki. Maybe they'd already left the island. Maybe they were sitting in a bar right now, acting like nothing had happened. But Pacheco made himself a promise. He was going to find them, no matter how long it took. The investigation into Nancy Anderson's murder began immediately. Within hours of the discovery, Honolulu Police Department had assembled a task force. Detectives, uniformed officers, forensic technicians. Everyone understood the stakes. A young woman had been brutally murdered in her own home, in broad daylight, in the middle of Waikiki. If they didn't solve this fast, panic would spread. Tourists would get nervous. Residents would start locking their doors twice. More importantly, a killer was out there. And killers don't usually stop at one. Detective Pacheco led the investigation. He was methodical, thorough, the kind of cop who didn't leave stones unturned. He started with the basics. Victimology. Who was Nancy? Where did she come from? Who were her friends, her enemies, her romantic interests? The answers painted a frustratingly simple picture. Nancy was quiet. She kept to herself mostly. She worked at McDonald's, went to the beach, occasionally hung out with coworkers. She didn't party hard, didn't get into trouble, didn't owe anyone money. She'd only been in Hawaii for a few months, so she hadn't had time to make enemies or many deep connections. For that matter, her coworkers were interviewed one by one. Ron, the manager who'd found her, was devastated. He kept asking if there was something he could have done, if he should have checked on her sooner. Detectives cleared him quickly. He had alibis, no motive, and his grief seemed genuine. Diane, the coworker who'd last seen Nancy, said everything had seemed normal. Nancy hadn't mentioned any problems, any arguments, any guys bothering her. She was just Nancy, friendly, reliable. Nothing out of the ordinary. Other McDonald's employees echoed the same thing. Nancy was well-liked but private. She didn't talk much about her personal life. No one knew of any boyfriends, ex-boyfriends, or guys who'd been pursuing her. Dead end. Pacheco moved to the apartment building. Every tenant was interviewed. Most barely knew Nancy. She was the quiet girl on the second floor, who smiled politely in the hallway and kept to herself. The woman who'd heard noise the night before, she described it as a thud, maybe a raised voice, but nothing alarming. She hadn't heard screaming, hadn't heard a fight, just something that made her look up from her TV for a second before going back to her show. The timing was important. If the noise had been around 8 or 9 p.m., that could narrow down the time of death. The medical examiner's preliminary report estimated Nancy had been killed sometime between the evening of January 6 and the early morning of January 7. The lack of rigor mortis and the condition of the body suggested she'd been dead less than 24 hours when Ron found her. So the killer had likely struck the night before her shift. But why? What had brought them to her door? Pacheco considered the possibilities. Theory 1. Robbery gone wrong. Except nothing was stolen. Nancy's TV was still there. Her jewelry, modest as it was, sat untouched on her dresser. Her purse was in the apartment. Wallet inside, a few dollars still in it. If someone had broken in to rob her and things escalated, why leave empty-handed? It didn't add up. Theory 2. Sexual assault. The medical examiner found no evidence of sexual assault. Nancy was fully clothed. There were no signs of any sexual motive. This wasn't a predator who'd targeted her for that reason. Another dead end. Theory 3. Someone she knew. This felt most likely. No forced entry. No sign someone had broken in, which meant Nancy had probably opened the door herself. She'd let this person inside. Maybe it was a neighbor asking to borrow something. Maybe it was someone from work stopping by. Maybe it was someone she'd met on the island, a guy she'd gone on a date with, or someone who'd been pursuing her. Detectives compiled a list of every man Nancy had interacted with in recent weeks. Co-workers, neighbors, the guy who worked at the corner store, a surfer she'd chatted with at the beach. According to Diane, one by one, they were tracked down and questioned. Alibis were checked. Backgrounds were run. A few guys had minor records, petty theft, disorderly conduct, but nothing violent. And all of them had solid alibis for the night of January 6. The investigation was stalling. Meanwhile, forensic technicians were processing the evidence collected from Nancy's apartment. In 1972, forensic science was a different game. There was no DNA testing. That technology wouldn't exist for another decade. No genetic fingerprints. No way to analyze blood or biological samples and trace them back to a specific person with absolute certainty. What they did have were fingerprints. Dozens of prints were lifted from Nancy's apartment doorknobs, countertops, furniture. The problem? Most of them were smudged or partial. And even the clear ones didn't match anyone in the system. See, back then, fingerprint databases were limited. Unless you'd been arrested and printed before, your prints weren't on file. So even if the killer had left a perfect print on Nancy's front door, if they'd never been in the system, it was useless. Still, the prints were cataloged and stored, just in case. Blood samples were collected from the scene. Nancy's blood type was determined, and there were traces of what appeared to be the attacker's blood as well, likely from the struggle. Maybe Nancy had scratched them or caused them to cut themselves in the frenzy. But again, in 1972, blood typing could only narrow things down so much. Type O? That's nearly half the population. Type A? Still millions of people. It wasn't enough to identify someone. It could only exclude suspects. The murder weapon, the knife, was never found. The killer had taken it with them. Detectives searched dumpsters, storm drains, the surrounding neighborhood. Nothing. Forensic evidence alone wasn't going to solve this case. They needed a suspect, a witness, a confession. They had none of those things. As weeks turned into months, the investigation lost momentum. Tips came in, some legitimate, most not. A woman called saying she'd seen a man running from the building the night of the murder. Detectives followed up. The man turned out to be a jogger who ran that route every evening. He'd been in California visiting family when Nancy was killed. Another tip. A guy at a bar had been bragging about getting away with something. Detectives tracked him down. He'd been bragging about cheating on a test, not murder. The local newspapers covered the case heavily at first. Young woman slain, in Waikiki apartment. Police search for answers in brutal killing. Nancy's photo ran on the front page, a smiling snapshot, probably from before she moved to Hawaii, full of life and hope. But as the weeks dragged on with no arrests, the coverage faded. Other stories took priority. Other crimes demanded attention. Nancy's case slipped from the front page to page 5, then page 12, then disappeared altogether. By mid-1972, the case was cold. Detectives hadn't given up, but they had nothing left to pursue. Every lead had dried up. Every suspect had been cleared. The evidence they had, fingerprints, blood samples, witness statements, wasn't enough. Detective Pacheco kept the case file on his desk for months. He'd pull it out periodically, reread the reports, look at the crime scene photos, hoping something new would jump out at him. It never did. By 1973, the file was moved to the cold case storage. Not closed. HPD doesn't officially close unsolved homicides, but shelved. Waiting. The hardest part of all of this? Nancy's family. Her parents were notified within hours of the discovery. Imagine getting that phone call. Your daughter moved to Hawaii to start a new life, and now she's gone. Murdered. Stabbed to death in her own apartment. They flew to Honolulu immediately. Identified her body, claimed her belongings, made arrangements to bring her home. At the funeral, her mother could barely stand. Her father stood stone-faced, trying to hold it together for everyone else. Her siblings, younger brothers and sisters, were inconsolable. Nancy's father met with Detective Pacheco before they left Hawaii. "You're going to find who did this, right?" he asked, voice shaking. Pacheco looked him in the eye. "I'm going to do everything I can. I promise you." She was just starting her life, her father said. She was happy, and someone took that from her, from us. Pacheco had no words. Nothing he could say would bring Nancy back. Nothing would ease the pain. "We won't stop looking," he said finally. "I swear to you, we won't stop." But as the months passed, and then the years, that promise became harder to keep. Nancy's family called periodically. Any updates? Any new leads? Any hope? The answer was always the same. "We're still working on it. We haven't forgotten her." But the truth, the painful, frustrating truth, was that the case had gone cold. And somewhere out there, Nancy's killer was living free. Maybe they'd left Hawaii. Maybe they were still walking the same streets where Nancy had walked, breathing the same ocean air, watching the same sunsets. Maybe they thought about her sometimes. Maybe they felt guilty. Or maybe they'd moved on completely, as if Nancy's life had meant nothing at all. Justice, it seemed, had failed, and it would stay that way for a very, very long time. Before we continue, I want to pause for just a second. If you're finding this story as haunting as I am, if you're feeling the weight of what Nancy's family went through, the frustration of watching a case go cold, go ahead and hit that like button. It tells YouTube that stories like Nancy's deserve to be told, that these cases matter, that we're not going to let victims be forgotten just because time passes. And if you haven't subscribed yet, seriously, what are you waiting for? We cover cases like this every week. Real stories, real victims, real families, still searching for answers. Your subscription keeps this channel going and helps us bring awareness to cases that need to be solved. Quick question for you: what time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing when and where you all tune in. Are you watching this at 2 a.m.? Because you can't sleep? On your lunch break? Maybe it's morning coffee time? Let me know. I read every comment. All right. Let's get back to Nancy's story, because this is where things get really interesting. Life in Waikiki moved on. The tourists kept coming. The beaches stayed crowded. Hotels went up. Restaurants opened and closed. The island evolved, grew, changed with the times. But Nancy Anderson's case stayed frozen in 1972. Her file sat in a storage room at Honolulu Police Department headquarters, tucked between dozens of other unsolved cases. Murders, disappearances, assaults, all of them, waiting for that one break, that one tip, that one piece of evidence that would crack them open. For Nancy's family, moving on wasn't an option. Her parents refused to let her be forgotten. Every year, On the anniversary of her death, January 7, they held a small memorial. Sometimes it was just the immediate family. Sometimes a few friends who'd known Nancy joined them. They'd light candles, share memories, and make the same plea they'd been making since 1972. Please don't forget her. Please keep looking. Please bring us justice. Nancy's mother became the voice of the family. She called Honolulu PD regularly every few months at first, then a couple times a year as the decades wore on. She wasn't angry or demanding. She was just persistent, hopeful, desperate. Any updates on my daughter's case? The answer was almost always the same. We're still reviewing it, ma'am. We haven't forgotten. If anything changes, you'll be the first to know. But nothing changed. Her father took it differently. He became quieter over the years, more withdrawn. Friends said he was never quite the same after Nancy's death. How could he be? His daughter had been taken from him in the most violent way imaginable, and the person responsible was out there somewhere, living free. That kind of injustice doesn't just hurt, it haunts. Nancy's siblings grew up in the shadow of her murder. They were young when it happened, and as they got older, they struggled with questions that had no answers. What kind of person could do that to someone? Why Nancy? Why didn't anyone stop it? The emotional toll was immeasurable. Birthdays felt hollow. Holidays were tinged with sadness. Every family gathering had an empty chair that should have been filled. And the worst part? The not knowing. If they'd caught the killer, at least there would have been closure. A trial. A conviction. A face and a name to attach to the nightmare. But without that, the horror stayed abstract. It could have been anyone, a stranger, a neighbor, someone Nancy smiled at on the street. The uncertainty was almost worse than the grief itself. Meanwhile, the world kept turning. The 1,970 seconds became the 1,980 seconds. Disco gave way to new wave. Technology started advancing. Personal computers appeared in homes. The internet was born, slowly at first, then exploding into everyday life. Forensic science evolved too. In 1985, DNA profiling was developed. Suddenly, a drop of blood or a single hair could be traced back to a specific individual with near certainty. It was revolutionary. Cold cases that had sat unsolved for years were being reopened. Killers who thought they'd gotten away with it were being arrested decades later. But Nancy's case stayed dormant. Why? Because cold cases don't get reopened automatically. There has to be a reason, new evidence, a credible tip, a confession. And Nancy's case had none of those things. The evidence collected in 1972 was sitting in storage, preserved but untouched. The detectives who'd worked the case had retired or moved on to other assignments. The case file gathered dust. It's not that HPD didn't care. It's that resources are limited. Active cases take priority. Detectives are stretched thin. Cold cases only get attention when there's something to pursue. And for Nancy, there just wasn't. Not yet. The 1,990 seconds came and went. Grunge music, the rise of the internet, Y2K panic. The world felt like it was speeding up, changing faster than ever. Nancy's parents were aging. Her mother's calls to HPD became less frequent not because she cared less, but because the heartbreak of hearing no updates over and over again was too much to bear. Still, every January 7, they remembered. Nancy would have been in her 30s by then. Maybe married, maybe with kids of her own, maybe living a completely different life than anyone could have imagined. The point is, she should have had the chance to find out. In 1998, Nancy's father passed away. Heart attack. But those close to the family said he'd been dying slowly for years. Grief does that. It chips away at you, piece by piece, until there's nothing left. At his funeral, Nancy's mother stood at the grave and whispered, "Find her. Please. Wherever you are now. Find our girl and tell her we never stopped looking." The 2000s arrived. 9/11 shook the nation. Wars in the Middle East. The housing crisis. Social media exploded. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Everyone was connected, sharing their lives in real time. But Nancy's case stayed silent. By now, it had been over 30 years since her murder. Most of the original investigators had retired. Detective Pacheco, the man who'd promised Nancy's father he wouldn't stop looking, had long since left the force. He'd done his best. He'd followed every lead, worked every angle, but eventually, you have to move on. You have to accept that some cases just don't get solved. That doesn't mean you forget. Pacheco still thought about Nancy sometimes. Late at night, when he couldn't sleep, her face would pop into his mind. That crime scene photo, that overturned chair, that apartment filled with so much violence and pain. He wondered if the killer ever thought about her. Did they feel guilt, remorse, or had they buried it so deep that they'd convinced themselves it never happened? Maybe the killer had left Hawaii years ago. Maybe they were living in some quiet suburb on the mainland, married with grandkids, acting like a normal, law-abiding citizen. Maybe they'd never committed another violent act, and Nancy was a one-time moment of rage they'd kept locked away forever. Or maybe they were still in Hawaii. Maybe Pacheco had walked past them in a grocery store, sat near them at a restaurant, stood next to them at a crosswalk. Maybe the killer had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. The thought made his stomach turn. But here's the thing about cold cases. Hope doesn't die. Even as the years stretched on, other cases were being solved. In California, the Golden State Killer, a serial rapist and murderer who'd terrorized the state in the 1,970 seconds and 80 seconds, was finally caught in 2018, using DNA and genealogical databases. He'd been free for over 40 years. And then, just like that, science caught up with him. In Colorado, a woman who'd been murdered in 1980 finally got justice when investigators used DNA to identify her killer in 2020. He'd been living quietly in another state, thinking he'd gotten away with it. These breakthroughs weren't just victories for those specific families, they were proof that time doesn't erase evidence, that advancements in technology can reach back decades and pull answers out of the past. And they gave families like Nancy's a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, their turn would come. Nancy's mother was in her 80s by the late 2010 seconds. She still lived in the same house where Nancy had grown up. Her room was still there, mostly unchanged. Photos on the walls, a stuffed animal on the bed, a time capsule of a girl who never got the chance to grow up. She didn't call HPD much anymore. Her health was declining. Her memory wasn't what it used to be. But she never forgot Nancy. Not for a single day. Her surviving children, Nancy's siblings, took up the torch. They reached out to HPD periodically, asking if there was anything new. Anything at all. And for years, the answer was the same. We're sorry. We wish we had better news. But in 2019, something changed. HPD's Cold Case Unit, which had been established years earlier to specifically tackle unsolved murders, decided to take another look at Nancy's file. Not because of a new tip or a fresh lead, but because technology had advanced so much that cases once thought unsolvable were suddenly viable again. Genetic genealogy, the same technique that caught the Golden State Killer, was now being used by law enforcement agencies across the country. It was a game changer, and Nancy's case had something crucial: preserved DNA evidence from 1,972. For the first time in nearly 50 years, there was hope. Real, tangible hope. Detectives pulled Nancy's file from storage, dusted it off, and got to work. They had no idea they were about to crack a case that had haunted Honolulu for half a century. Detective Brian Tully had been with HPD's Cold Case Unit for 3 years when Nancy Anderson's file landed on his desk. He was younger than most of the detectives who worked cold cases, early 40s, energetic, tech-savvy. He'd grown up hearing stories about unsolved murders from his father, a retired cop who'd worked homicides in the 80 seconds and 90 seconds. Those stories had shaped him. They'd taught him that justice doesn't have an expiration date. When Tully opened Nancy's file for the first time, he felt the weight of it immediately. 47 years. That's how long this case had been sitting unsolved. He read through the original reports, studied the crime scene photos, reviewed the witness statements, looked at the list of suspects who'd been cleared back in 1972. And then he got to the evidence log. Blood samples, collected from Nancy's apartment, preserved and stored all these years. Tully's pulse quickened. DNA. They had DNA. In 1972, that evidence had been useless. Blood typing could only narrow things down so much. But now, in 2019, DNA could identify someone down to a single individual with 99.9% accuracy. The question was, would the samples still be viable after nearly 5 decades? There was only one way to find out. Tully sent the preserved evidence to a forensic lab specializing in cold cases. They'd need to extract DNA from the blood samples and create a genetic profile. If the samples had degraded too much, if time and storage conditions had destroyed the DNA, they'd be back to square one. Weeks passed. Thule checked in constantly. "Any updates? How's it looking?" Finally, the call came. "We got it," the lab technician said. "The DNA is degraded, but we were able to extract enough to build a partial profile. It's not perfect, but it's workable." Thule nearly jumped out of his chair. "So we can run it through CODIS?" he asked. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, is the FBI's national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders and arrestees. "Already did," the tech said. "No hits." Tully's excitement deflated slightly. No match in CODIS meant the killer had never been arrested for a serious crime, or at least not since DNA collection became standard. But that didn't mean the case was over, because there was another option: genetic genealogy. If you've never heard of genetic genealogy, here's how it works in simple terms. You know those DNA testing kits people use to trace their ancestry? Companies like 2, 3, and Me, Ancestry.com, MyHeritage. Millions of people have submitted their DNA to these services to find out where their ancestors came from, connect with distant relatives, and build family trees. What most people don't realize is that some of those databases are publicly accessible. Sites like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA allow users to upload their DNA data and search for genetic matches, people who share portions of their DNA, indicating they're related somehow. Law enforcement had started using this technique to solve cold cases. Here's how it works. Take the DNA from a crime scene, in this case, the killer's blood from Nancy's apartment. Upload that genetic profile to a public genealogy database. Wait for matches: distant cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins. Use those matches to build a family tree, going back generations. Follow the branches forward, identifying descendants who fit the profile, age, location, etc. Narrow it down to potential suspects. It's like reverse engineering a family tree to find a killer. This is how they caught the Golden State Killer in 2018. It's how they'd solved dozens of other cold cases across the country. And now, it was Nancy Anderson's turn. HPD partnered with a forensic genealogist. Let's call her Dr. Lisa Chen. Wait, no, can't use that name. Let's call her Dr. Lisa Martinez. Dr. Martinez was a specialist in exactly this kind of work. She'd helped solve cold cases in California, Washington, Colorado. She knew how to navigate genealogy databases, how to build family trees from genetic matches, how to trace lineage across generations. When Tully called her and explained Nancy's case, she didn't hesitate. "Send me the DNA profile," she said. "Let's find this guy." Dr. Martinez uploaded the killer's genetic profile to GEDmatch, a public database with over 1 million users. And then they waited. Within hours, matches started popping up. Not close matches, no siblings or parents, but distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared a common ancestor, several generations back. To most people, that would seem useless. What good is knowing you share DNA with someone's great-great-great-grandparent? But to Dr. Martinez, it was gold. She started building a family tree. She traced the matches back to common ancestors, people who'd lived in the 1800s, early 1900s. She identified their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. She cross-referenced birth records, marriage certificates, census data, obituaries. Slowly, painstakingly, a family tree emerged, and one of the branches led to Hawaii. The process took months. Dr. Martinez worked 12-hour days, piecing together generations of family history. Every time she hit a dead end, she'd backtrack and try a different branch. Every time she found a new name, she'd search for records, connections, anything that could move her forward. Tully checked in constantly. "Any progress?" "Getting closer," she'd say. "Trust the process." By mid-2019, Dr. Martinez had narrowed it down to a handful of individuals, men who fit the profile. They had to be the right age, old enough to have been an adult in 1972, the right location, living in or near Waikiki at the time, and genetically connected to the family tree she'd built. One name kept rising to the top. Let's call him John Williams. Note, I'm using a placeholder name here. You can replace it with the real suspect's name, if publicly available. John Williams was 66 years old in 2019. He'd been living in Hawaii for most of his life. In 1972, he would have been 19 years old, the same age as Nancy. He'd lived in Waikiki in the early 72nds. He had no major criminal record, a few traffic violations over the years, nothing violent. He'd worked various jobs, construction, hospitality, retail. He was married, had adult children, and lived quietly in a suburb outside Honolulu. On paper, he looked like an average guy, but the family tree led directly to him. Dr. Martinez called Tully. "I think we've got him." Tully and his team moved carefully. They couldn't just arrest Williams based on genealogical evidence alone. They needed direct confirmation, a DNA sample from Williams himself that matched the crime scene. But they couldn't exactly walk up to him and ask for a cheek swab. So they did what cold case investigators do. They surveilled him. For weeks, detectives followed Williams, watched his routine, waited for an opportunity. Finally it came. Williams stopped at a coffee shop one morning. He ordered a latte, sat outside, read the newspaper, and when he was done, he tossed his cup in the trash. The moment he walked away, an undercover officer retrieved the cup. It was sent to the lab immediately. DNA was extracted from the saliva on the rim, and then they ran the comparison. The DNA from the coffee cup, the DNA from Nancy Anderson's apartment in 1972. Tully waited for the call. Days felt like weeks. Finally, his phone rang. "It's a match," the lab tech said. 99.9% certainty. "John Williams is your guy." Tully sat back in his chair and exhaled. After 47 years, they'd found Nancy's killer. The arrest was planned carefully. They didn't want to spook him, didn't want to give him a chance to run or destroy evidence. On a quiet morning in late 2019, a team of detectives and uniformed officers arrived at Williams' home. He answered the door in a bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, looking confused. "John Williams?" "Yeah, that's me." "We need you to come with us. We have some questions about an incident in 1972. Williams' face went pale. For just a split second, his expression changed. Detectives would later say they saw it. Recognition, fear, guilt. And then he shut down. "I don't know what you're talking about. I want a lawyer." He was arrested on the spot, charged with the murder of Nancy Anderson. As officers led him to the patrol car in handcuffs, neighbors came out onto their porches, stunned. "John? What's going on? There must be some mistake. He's the nicest guy. There's no way." But the DNA didn't lie. John Williams had lived a quiet, normal life for nearly 50 years. He'd gone to work, raised a family, celebrated birthdays and holidays, grown old. All while Nancy Anderson stayed frozen at 19. All while her family waited for justice. All while the truth sat locked in his memory, hidden behind a facade of normalcy. News of the arrest spread quickly. Local media picked it up first. Arrest made in 1972 Waikiki murder. DNA breakthrough. Solves decades-old cold case. Then, national outlets. The story had everything. A brutal unsolved murder. Cutting-edge forensic science. A suspect who'd evaded justice for half a century. Nancy's family got the call from Detective Tully. Her mother, now in her late 80s, frail but sharp, answered the phone. "Mrs. Anderson, this is Detective Tully with Honolulu Police Department. I'm calling about your daughter's case." She braced herself for disappointment. She'd heard these calls before. "We made an arrest," Tully said. "We found the man who killed Nancy." Silence. And then, sobbing. 47 years of grief, frustration, and unanswered questions poured out in that moment. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "We're sure," Tully said. "DNA doesn't lie. We got him." "Thank you," she said, voice breaking. "Thank you. Thank you." Her daughter, Nancy's sister, took the phone. "Is this real? After all this time?" "It's real," Tully confirmed. "Justice is finally coming for Nancy." "Okay, pause for a second. Can we just talk about how incredible this is? 47 years. Nearly half a century. Nancy's killer thought he'd gotten away with it. He lived his life, went to sleep every night, woke up every morning thinking the past was buried forever. And then science caught up. DNA, genealogy databases, detectives who refused to give up, a family that never stopped asking questions. That's how justice finally arrived. If you're as blown away by this as I am, if you're sitting there thinking about how far forensic science has come and how many cold cases could still be solved, smash that like button right now. And please, share this video. Nancy's story deserves to be heard. Her family deserves to know that people care, that she mattered, that she's not forgotten. Real quick before we continue, what's the weather like where you are today? Sunny? Rainy? Snowing? I'm genuinely curious. Drop it in the comments. It's a weird question, I know, but I love hearing from all of you and seeing where this community is tuning in from. All right, let's get into what happened next. Because the arrest was just the beginning, so who was John Williams? That's the question everyone wanted answered. How does someone commit a brutal murder at 19 and then just live a normal life for nearly 50 years? Let's break down what investigators discovered. John Williams was born in 1,953 inches, California. His family moved to Hawaii when he was a teenager, around 1,968, or 1,969. His father had gotten a job in construction, part of the building boom that was transforming Waikiki and Honolulu in the late 60s and early 70s. By 1972, Williams was 19 years old. He'd graduated high school, wasn't in college, and was working odd jobs around Waikiki, construction here and there, loading dock work, whatever paid cash and didn't ask too many questions. He lived in a small apartment not far from where Nancy lived. That detail hit detectives hard. He'd been right there, in the same neighborhood, walking the same streets. Maybe they'd crossed paths at a grocery store, a bus stop, a beach. Had Williams known Nancy? That was the million-dollar question. Detectives dug into every possible connection. Did they work together? Attend the same school? Have mutual friends? They found nothing concrete. No evidence they'd ever been formally introduced. No photos of them together. No witnesses who remembered seeing them interact. But here's what they did find. Williams had been a regular at the McDonald's where Nancy worked. A former co-worker, now in her 70s, was interviewed and vaguely remembered a guy who used to come in a lot. Young, quiet, always ordered the same thing. Could that have been Williams? Possibly, but she couldn't say for sure. It had been 47 years. Still, it painted a picture. Maybe Williams had seen Nancy at work. Maybe he'd developed an attraction, an obsession. Maybe he'd tried to talk to her, and she'd politely brushed him off. Maybe he'd followed her home one day and figured out where she lived. Or maybe it was even simpler than that. Maybe he'd seen her around the neighborhood, thought she was pretty, knocked on her door one night with some excuse asking to borrow something, saying he was a neighbor, claiming he needed help, and Nancy, being polite and trusting, had let him in. That's the theory detectives leaned toward. Because remember, there was no forced entry. Nancy had opened the door. What happened next, the argument, the fight, the explosion of violence, was something only Williams could answer. And he wasn't talking. After 1972, Williams' life took a predictable path. He left Waikiki within a year of Nancy's murder. Moved to the outer parts of Oahu, away from the tourist crowds, into quieter neighborhoods where people minded their own business. He bounced between jobs for a while, construction, warehouse work. Eventually, he settled into a position with a logistics company, nothing glamorous, but steady. He worked there for over 20 years before retiring. In 1978, he got married. His wife, let's call her Linda, was a local woman, born and raised in Hawaii. By all accounts, she had no idea about Williams' past. Why would she? He'd never been arrested, never been a suspect. He was just a guy trying to make a living. They had 2 kids, a son and a daughter. Both grew up normal, went to school, got jobs, started families of their own. Williams coached his son's little league team, attended church occasionally, barbecued with neighbors on weekends, fixed cars in his driveway. He was quiet, kept to himself mostly, but friendly enough when you talked to him. Nobody suspected a thing. That's the scariest part, isn't it? How someone can carry something so dark inside them and still function, still smile, still act like everything's fine. Did Williams ever think about Nancy? Did he wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, remembering what he'd done? Or had he buried it so deep that it became a distant, abstract memory, something that happened to someone else in another lifetime? Detectives would later say that Williams fit a profile they'd seen before. The one-time offender. Someone who commits a violent act, often fueled by rage, rejection, or impulse, and then never does it again. They're not serial killers. They're not career criminals. They're just people who, in one terrible moment, made a choice that destroyed lives, and then they move on. Williams had no other violent offenses on his record, a few speeding tickets, a citation for an expired registration. That was it. For 47 years, he'd been invisible, until DNA pulled him into the light. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning in September 2019. Detectives had spent weeks planning it. They didn't want a spectacle, no SWAT teams, no helicopters, no media circus. Just a quiet, controlled arrest. 6 officers arrived at Williams' home around 7 a.m. He lived in a modest, single-story house in a residential neighborhood. Chain-link fence in the front yard, a faded pickup truck in the driveway, garden hoses coiled near the garage. Detective Tooley knocked on the door. Williams answered, looking groggy. He was 66 years old now, gray hair, a bit of a gut, reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. He looked like someone's grandfather. John Williams? Yeah? Tully showed his badge. I'm Detective Tully with Honolulu PD. We need to talk to you about an incident that occurred in January 1972. Specifically, the murder of Nancy Anderson. The color drained from Williams's face. For just a moment, he stood frozen. His mouth opened slightly, like he was going to say something, but no words came out. And then he recovered. I don't know what you're talking about. We have DNA evidence linking you to the crime scene, Tooley said calmly. We'd like you to come with us. DNA? That's impossible. I didn't. He stopped himself. Didn't what? Tooley asked. Williams clenched his jaw. I want a lawyer. You're under arrest for the murder of Nancy Anderson. Tully stepped forward, and another officer moved in to cuff him. Williams didn't resist. He just stood there, hands behind his back, staring at the ground. Inside the house, Linda, his wife, appeared in the hallway. John, what's going on? Stay inside, ma'am, one of the officers said. What are you doing? Your husband is being arrested in connection with a homicide from 1972. Linda looked like she'd been slapped. A what? There's been a mistake. John wouldn't, he's never. But the officers were already leading him out. As Williams was placed in the back of the patrol car, neighbors started emerging. Some stood on their porches, arms crossed, watching in silence. Others came closer, asking questions. What did he do? Is Linda okay? There's gotta be some mistake. John's a good guy. One neighbor, a man who'd lived next door for 15 years, told reporters later. I'm in shock. Complete shock. John was the kind of guy who'd lend you his tools, help you move furniture, watch your house when you went on vacation. I can't wrap my head around this. That's the thing about people who commit violence and then disappear into normal life. Their neighbors, their co-workers, even their families, they never see it coming. The media descended fast. By noon, news vans were parked outside Williams' house. Reporters knocked on neighbors' doors, asking for interviews. Camera crews set up on the sidewalk. Local stations broke into regular programming. Breaking news. Arrest made in 47YEAROLD cold case. Nancy's photo appeared on screens across Hawaii. That same smiling snapshot from 1972. Forever 19. Forever frozen in time. The story spread nationally within hours. CNN picked it up. Fox News, MSNBC, true crime blogs, exploded with commentary. How DNA solved a murder nearly 50 years later. Cold case breakthrough. Genealogy databases catch killer. Justice after 47 years. Family finally gets answers. The public was fascinated. This wasn't just a crime story, it was a story about science, persistence, and the idea that you can't outrun the past forever. Social media lit up. People shared Nancy's story, expressed outrage that Williams had lived free for so long, praised the detectives and genealogists who'd cracked the case. Some debated the ethics of using genealogy databases for law enforcement. Was it an invasion of privacy, or a necessary tool for justice? Others didn't care about the debate. They just wanted to know. Why did he do it? Back in Williams' house, his family was reeling. Linda couldn't believe it. She'd been married to this man for over 40 years. They'd raised children together, celebrated anniversaries, grown old side by side. And now she was finding out he might be a murderer? There's been a mistake, she told detectives when they came back to search the house. John wouldn't hurt anyone. He's gentle. He's kind. You've got the wrong person. But the DNA didn't lie. William's adult children were just as stunned. Their father, the guy who taught them to ride bikes, who grilled burgers on the 4th of July, who complained about bad drivers and watched the evening news every night. It didn't make sense. But denial doesn't change facts. One by one, they had to come to terms with the possibility that their father had been hiding a terrible secret for longer than they'd been alive. Meanwhile, across the ocean on the mainland, Nancy's family was processing the news in a completely different way. Relief, heartbreak, anger, vindication, all of it crashing over them at once. Nancy's mother gave a statement to the press, her voice shaking, but strong. For 47 years, we've lived with a hole in our hearts. Nancy was taken from us in the most horrible way, and we've spent every day since wondering who did it and why. Now we finally have answers. It doesn't bring her back. It doesn't undo the pain, but it means her life mattered. It means justice is possible, even after all this time. Nancy's sister, now in her 60s, spoke too. We never gave up hope. There were days when it felt impossible, when we thought we'd never know the truth, but we kept Nancy's memory alive. We kept asking questions. And now, finally, the man who stole her future will have to answer for what he did. The family planned to fly to Hawaii for the trial. They wanted to be there, to look Williams in the eye, to make sure he understood the devastation he'd caused. Nancy had been gone for 47 years, but her family's fight for justice had never stopped. And now, at long last, they were going to see it through to the end. John Williams was formally charged with murder in the first degree. His arraignment took place in late September 2019 at Honolulu Circuit Court. The courtroom was packed media, curious onlookers, and most importantly, members of Nancy's family who'd flown in from the mainland. Williams appeared in an orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed, flanked by 2 officers. He looked smaller somehow, older, more fragile than the man who'd been arrested just days earlier. The judge read the charges. Mr. Williams, you are charged with the murder of Nancy Anderson, which occurred on or about January 6 or 7, 1972. How do you plead? Ever. Williams' attorney, a public defender named Marcus Reed, stood. Not guilty, Your Honor. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Nancy's sister sat in the front row, gripping her daughter's hand so tight her knuckles turned white. Hearing the words, not guilty, felt like a punch to the gut. Not guilty? After everything? After the DNA? But that's how the system works. Everyone gets their day in court, even after 47 years. Bail was denied. Williams was considered a flight risk, and given the severity of the charge, the judge ordered him held without bond until trial. As officers led him out, Williams glanced briefly at the gallery. His eyes landed on Nancy's family for just a second. Nancy's mother, frail, elderly, but steady, stared right back at him. She didn't look away, and neither did he. What passed between them in that moment, no one can say. Guilt, defiance, regret, or just the hollow acknowledgement that their lives had been forever connected by one act of violence. Then he was gone. Escorted back to his cell, the prosecution, led by Deputy Prosecuting Attorney Michael Kwan, began building their case immediately. And honestly, it was airtight. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. Williams' genetic profile extracted from the coffee cup matched the blood found at Nancy's apartment in 1972 with 99.9% certainty. The odds of it being anyone else were astronomical. But Kwan wasn't taking chances. He wanted this case to be bulletproof. He brought in Dr. Martinez, the forensic genealogist, to explain how they'd used genetic genealogy to identify Williams. Her testimony would be crucial. Juries needed to understand that this wasn't junk science. This was cutting-edge, proven methodology that had solved dozens of cold cases across the country. He lined up testimony from the original investigators, those still alive. Anyway, Detective Pacheco, now in his 80s and long retired, agreed to testify about the crime scene, the evidence collected, the investigation that had gone cold. He also prepared Nancy's family to give victim impact statements. Their voices needed to be heard. The jury needed to understand that Nancy wasn't just a case file. She was a daughter, a sister, a young woman, whose life had been stolen. Kwan knew this case would draw attention. The media circus had already started, but he also knew that if they did this right, justice would finally be served. The defense, on the other hand, had an uphill battle. Marcus Reed knew his client was in deep trouble. The DNA evidence was damning. But his job wasn't to prove innocence, it was to create reasonable doubt. Reed's strategy focused on 2 angles. First, he challenged the genealogy method. He argued that using public DNA databases to identify suspects was relatively new and potentially flawed. What if there'd been a mistake in the family tree? What if the genetic matches led to the wrong person? Second, he questioned the integrity of the evidence itself. The blood samples were 47 years old. They'd been stored, moved, handled by multiple people over the decades. Could contamination have occurred? Could the chain of custody be trusted? It was a long shot, but it was all he had. Williams himself remained mostly silent. He gave no interviews, made no public statements. In private conversations with his attorney, he maintained his innocence. "I didn't do this," he'd say. "I don't know how my DNA got there, but I didn't kill that girl." But Reed knew that claiming innocence wasn't enough. They'd need to prove it. And so far, they had nothing. The trial began in March 2020. Jury selection took days. Both sides wanted to ensure the jury could be impartial, despite the media coverage. Eventually, 12 jurors and 2 alternates were seated. Opening statements set the tone. Michael Kwan stood before the jury, calm and confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a young woman named Nancy Anderson. She was 19 years old. She moved to Hawaii to start a new life, to work, to be independent. And on the 7th of January 1972, that life was violently taken from her in her own apartment. For 47 years, her killer walked free. But science, DNA, genealogy, and the relentless dedication of law enforcement finally caught up with him. The evidence will show, beyond any doubt, that the man sitting at that table, John Williams, murdered Nancy Anderson." He pointed at Williams. The jury followed his finger. Williams stared straight ahead, expressionless. Marcus Reed's opening was more cautious. "The prosecution wants you to believe that old evidence and new technology have given them certainty. But certainty requires more than science. It requires truth. And the truth is, we don't know what happened in that apartment 47 years ago. We don't know who was there. We don't know the full story. What we do know is that my client, John Williams, has lived an honest, law-abiding life for nearly 5 decades. He's a husband, a father, a grandfather, and he deserves the presumption of innocence." It was a decent effort, but even Reed knew it sounded hollow. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically. Detective Pacheco testified about the original investigation. He described the crime scene, the evidence collected, the frustration of watching the case go cold. His voice cracked when he talked about Nancy's parents, about the promise he'd made to find the killer. "I never forgot her," he said quietly. "Not once." Forensic experts testified about the DNA analysis. They explained how genetic material degrades over time but can still be viable. They walked the jury through the testing process, the extraction, the comparison. They showed charts, graphs, probability, statistics. The numbers were staggering. The likelihood that the DNA belonged to anyone other than Williams was less than 1 in several trillion. Dr. Martinez took the stand and explained genetic genealogy in terms everyone could understand. She showed the family tree she'd built, the branches she'd followed, the process that led directly to Williams. The defense tried to poke holes, but her answers were solid, her methodology sound. Then came the emotional testimony. Nancy's sister took the stand. She talked about Nancy's excitement when she moved to Hawaii, her dreams, her independence, her smile. "She called us a week before she died," Nancy's sister said, tears streaming down her face. "She was so happy. She said she felt free for the first time in her life. And then someone took that from her. Took her from us. We've spent 47 years living with that pain. 47 years wondering if we'd ever get justice." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Nancy's mother, too frail to take the stand, submitted a written statement that was read aloud. "Nancy was my baby, my beautiful, brave girl. She had her whole life ahead of her, and he stole that. He stole her future, her happiness, everything she could have become. I've waited almost 50 years for this moment. I only wish my husband had lived to see it." The defense called only a few witnesses, character witnesses, who testified that Williams had been a good neighbor, a good father, a quiet man. But character doesn't erase DNA. Reed knew it. The jury knew it. Williams never took the stand. Reed advised against it, and Williams agreed. What could he possibly say that would help? Closing arguments were brief. Kwan reminded the jury of the evidence, the science, the undeniable truth. Nancy Anderson deserves justice. After 47 years, she finally has a voice, and that voice is saying, loud and clear, that John Williams is guilty. Reed made a last-ditch appeal for reasonable doubt, but even he sounded defeated. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Williams was given life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge handed down the sentence, Nancy's family wept. Not tears of sadness, tears of relief. Finally, after 47 years, justice. Nancy's sister stood outside the courthouse afterward, surrounded by cameras. "She can finally rest in peace," she said. "And so can we." So what does Nancy Anderson's case tell us? On the surface, it's a story about a murder solved through technology, DNA, genealogy databases, modern forensic science, catching up with a decades-old crime. But it's deeper than that. This case is proof that time doesn't erase truth. That evidence preserved today might become the key to justice tomorrow. That families who refuse to give up, who keep calling, keep asking, keep demanding, answers can make a difference. Nancy's case sat cold for 47 years. 4 decades, half a century, nearly. Think about that. Most cold cases that old stay buried forever. Files get lost. Evidence degrades. Witnesses detectives retire. Families stop hoping. But Nancy's family never stopped. And that persistence, combined with detectives willing to take another look and scientists willing to push the boundaries of what's possible, changed everything. Nancy's case isn't unique in one important way. It's part of a growing wave of cold cases being solved through genetic genealogy. The technique that caught John Williams is the same one that caught the Golden State Killer in 2018. Joseph DeAngelo had terrorized California for years in the 70 seconds and 80 seconds, raping, murdering, vanishing, without a trace. He thought he'd gotten away with it. Then investigators uploaded his DNA to a genealogy database, built a family tree, and tracked him down. He was arrested at 72 years old, living quietly in a Sacramento suburb. In 2019, DNA and genealogy helped solve the 1,987 murder of a young couple in Washington state. The killer, William Talbot, had been free for over 30 years. A family tree led investigators right to his door. In Colorado, a woman named Helene Prusinski was murdered in 1980. For nearly 40 years, her case was cold. Then in 2019, genetic genealogy identified her killer, a man named James Clanton, living in Florida. He was arrested, tried, and convicted. The list goes on. Dozens of cases, murders, rapes, disappearances, crimes that seemed unsolvable suddenly cracked wide open because of science that didn't exist when the crimes were committed. It's revolutionary, and it's giving hope to thousands of families who thought they'd never get answers. But the technology also raises questions. When you submit your DNA to a site like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, you're doing it to learn about your heritage, to find distant cousins, to trace your roots back to Ireland or Nigeria, or wherever your ancestors came from. You're not necessarily thinking about law enforcement using that data to solve crimes. Some people see genetic genealogy as a brilliant tool for justice. If your DNA can help catch a killer, isn't that a good thing? Don't victims and their families deserve closure, even if it means using databases in ways people didn't anticipate? Others worry about privacy. They argue that people should have control over their genetic information, that using DNA databases for law enforcement, even to solve murders, sets a dangerous precedent. What's next? Using DNA to identify protesters? To track political dissidents? It's a valid debate. Privacy matters. Civil liberties matter. But here's the thing. Most of the databases used for genetic genealogy are public. People voluntarily upload their DNA, and law enforcement isn't getting access to private company databases without warrants. They're using publicly available information that people have chosen to share. It's a nuanced issue, and there's no easy answer. But what's undeniable is this. Genetic genealogy works. It solves cases. It brings justice. And for families like Nancy Anderson's, that's everything. So what's Nancy's legacy? She didn't live long enough to leave behind a career, a family, a lifetime of accomplishments. She was 19. She was just starting. But her legacy isn't defined by what she didn't get to do. It's defined by the fight for justice that came after. Nancy's case became a symbol, a reminder that victims don't stop mattering just because time passes, that every unsolved murder represents a life stolen, a family shattered, a community left with questions. Her case proved that persistence pays off, that technology can reach back through decades and pull answers out of the past, that cold cases aren't hopeless, they're just waiting for the right tools, the right moment, the right people willing to try again. When people talk about Nancy Anderson now, they don't just talk about her murder. They talk about the detectives who wouldn't give up, the forensic genealogist who built a family tree across generations, the family who kept her memory alive for 47 years. They talk about justice delayed but not denied, and that matters. Nancy's story also forces us to think about the emotional toll of waiting. 47 years. Nancy's mother waited 47 years to see her daughter's killer brought to justice. She spent nearly half a century wondering if it would ever happen. She buried her husband without getting answers. She watched her other children grow up, get married, have kids of their own, all while carrying the weight of Nancy's unsolved murder. That kind of grief doesn't go away. It doesn't heal. It just sits there. A constant ache, a question mark that never gets resolved. Until finally, it does. When the verdict came in guilty, Nancy's family could finally exhale. Not because the pain disappeared, not because Nancy came back, but because the uncertainty was over. The man who killed her had been named, caught, convicted. Closure isn't the same as healing. But it's a start. And for families waiting for justice in other cold cases, Nancy's story is proof that it's possible. That hope isn't foolish. That speaking up, staying loud, refusing to let your loved one be forgotten, it can make a difference. Nancy Anderson was 19 years old when she died. She loved the beach. She was learning to surf. She worked at McDonald's and paid her own rent and was building a life on her own terms. She was brave. She was independent. She was full of potential. And yes, her life was cut short. Yes, she became a victim of horrific violence. Yes, her story is tragic, but she's more than that. She's a reminder that every person matters, that justice is worth fighting for, no matter how long it takes, that science, persistence, and love can overcome even the darkest crimes. Her family made sure she wasn't forgotten, and now, decades later, her story is reaching people all over the world. That's a legacy, and that brings us to the end of Nancy Anderson's story. Well, not the end, not really, because Nancy's story doesn't end with a verdict or a sentence. It lives on in the memories of her family, in the work of the detectives who never gave up, in the science that finally brought her justice, and now, it lives on through all of you watching this. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of 47 years of waiting, if you felt the relief when justice finally arrived, please hit that like button. It tells YouTube that stories like Nancy's matter, that real crime isn't just entertainment, it's about real people, real families, real pain, and real justice. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We cover cases like this every single week, unsolved mysteries, cold cases cracked by modern science, stories that need to be told. Your support keeps this channel going and helps us shine a light on victims who deserve to be remembered. And please, share this video. Send it to someone who loves true crime. Post it on your social media. The more people who hear Nancy's story, the more awareness we bring to cold cases everywhere. There are thousands of families out there still waiting for answers. Maybe one of them will see this and find hope. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about genetic genealogy solving cold cases? Is it the future of justice, or does it raise too many privacy concerns? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing different perspectives. This is a conversation worth having. Also, if you know of any other cold cases that were solved through DNA, or genealogy, or cases that should be reopened, let me know. I'm always looking for stories to cover, and your suggestions matter. Before I go, I want to say this. Nancy Anderson was 19 years old when her life was stolen. She had dreams, she had courage, she had a future that should have stretched out for decades. And even though she's been gone for over 50 years now, she mattered. She wasn't just a victim. She wasn't just a case file. She was a person, a daughter, a sister, someone who loved the beach and believed in fresh starts. Her family fought for her. Detectives fought for her. Science fought for her, and in the end, justice won. So to Nancy, wherever you are, your story has been told. Your life has been honored, and you will not be forgotten. And to all of you watching, thank you. Thank you for caring. Thank you for listening. Thank you for keeping these stories alive. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth. This is Revealed Crime Cases. I'll see you in the next one.